is Monday, February 19th. Hopefully you are enjoying the day. Many of you might have President's Day off or just enjoying the beginning of school vacation week. So either way, even if you are working, thank you so much for joining us as we kick off Golocal Live on this Monday afternoon. For my first guest, I would like to say hello and welcome to the Providence City Archivist, Caleb Horton. He is joining me now live in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Caleb, hello.
Yeah, hello. Nice to have me here, and I'm glad to do an interview today for you guys.
Yeah, we're so grateful to have you here today. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the archive itself, how it came to be, what's in it, a little bit about what you do. But first we're going to talk a little bit about the exhibit that's coming up. It's opening this Thursday for Black History Month. It's called Home, the Housing Struggle in Providence from 1950 through today. So last week we spoke with Councilwoman Mary Kay Harris about the show, about the exhibit. So we wanted to get your input and find out a little bit more about the documents itself and what's actually in it. Can you talk to us just a little bit about the exhibit?
So, well, the exhibit takes place roughly 1950, right after big changes that were happening in the United States at the time that actually affected Providence quite greatly. They call it the White Flight. This is basically right after World War II. There was, the GIs were returning home with the GI Bill, and Providence experienced one of the greatest population losses per capita, about 28% of any city in the United States. According to the U.S. Census in 1950, we had about almost 250,000 people living in the city, and by 1970 that dipped to about 180,000.
Oh, wow.
So the stories are basically about our kind of civil rights movement up here. In the South it was Jim Crow and segregation. Ours had really a lot to do with fair housing, which is a form of segregation in itself, but so our story is unique to the out-migration and how that left the city in kind of an urban decay, and the lack of affordable housing and fair housing.
That's pretty, no, I was going to say, that's pretty incredible. And to know that, and we've talked about this before on the show, to know that the inequalities and the fights here were different than they were in other places, and not to say that they were very different. Where do we know, looking at these archives, where people went?
Yeah, specifically, most of the exhibit actually focuses on affordable, like project housing. Typically, Chad Brown, Valley View, Cotting Court, Roger Williams, the Hartford Park housing projects. There was not a whole lot of these housing projects actually were built in the 1940s during World War II, predicting that the GIs would actually move into those buildings, and they didn't. And a lot of minorities went into those areas. And we talk about just the fight just to get more affordable housing, not to be segregated in these regions, so to speak. And it's interesting to see it's a story of basically, you have these fair housing movements, and actually in 1964 there was a big civil rights movement, and they had a march outside the City Hall. They had a march outside the State House. So the theme in this exhibit is basically what is home, and what defines home, and part of it's just the fight to have housing that's affordable and available and not in a kind of decay. There's several examples of that we show in the exhibit. So it's actually kind of a roller coaster. There's a lot of things that they succeeded at and achieving, and then there's things that it kind of went backwards and things went into decay, and the lack of affordable housing that was really out there.
It's pretty incredible to think that this movement started, and if you look at where we are today, we're still fighting the same fight. We're still looking at people who still need fair and affordable housing. Multiple populations, multiple people are still looking at continuing that effort. What are some of the, if we can just have you scoot over a little bit. Caleb, thank you. We're still looking at continuing this effort. It might be in different forms, but you mentioned there are different parts of this exhibit that you can see there were victories, and then of course we're still looking at continuing this battle. What are some of the either items that people can look at and enjoy? Like, are there flyers from different marches and that kind of thing? What are some of the things that people can look at and say, oh, wow, that really happened?
Well, we showcase a lot of city documents. documents. There was a lot of reports, annual reports, a lot of stuff from the Providence Housing Authority. Actually, a lot of our photographs come from the Providence Journal, which is a big help. A lot of the artifacts, they're not necessarily 3D objects. We mostly have, paper documents, reports, annual reports, and things like that. But we have these reports, that document the history since about roughly 1945, with one of the first annual reports from the Providence Housing Authority that actually talks about the city being divided into 3 different central areas. Wow. We actually have reports when they built the I-95 project, which actually greatly affected entire neighborhoods. Entire neighborhoods were moved and people were displaced, and kind of it especially affected minority populations who kind of had to move into new neighborhoods that were completely alien to them, almost into these to these different housing projects. It really kind of reinvented the city. So we have a lot of those kind of reports, a lot of government reports and things of that nature.
Well, it's interesting when you think about it. You just mentioned I-95. I mean, really probably uprooted people's lives. I mean, it must have. And so to be able to go back and look at the records and see how it did that and how it impacted that, I mean, to me, that's just fascinating. I was over at Roger Williams Park just this weekend, and you can see, you're in the park, and then people's houses are up against the park, and there's graves right in the park, and you're looking at the dynamics, and it's quite interesting. So to be able to go back and look at the records, I think that could be pretty unique.
Yeah, I mean,
to be able to do that.
It essentially divided the city into 3 sections, and even the North Burial Ground, which I like to tell stories about that. Actually, even there's whole burial plots that ended up getting plowed over. Essentially, they were called paupers' graves, so they were, they usually belonged to more of the poor people that couldn't afford, gravestones and things like that. But there's a lot of history that was kind of lost, which
what happened?
They basically just plowed right through it when they built I-95. Historic preservation back in 1962 wasn't what it is today, essentially.
Wow, that's troubling.
Yeah.
So those people are just gone?
I think they moved a lot of the graves, but I don't know how counted for it is.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow. Well, so now at least we all have a highway to drive on.
Yes, exactly.
Wow, that's interesting. So I guess we can all be proud of the good records that are kept and the preservation that we do come to have. So the exhibit does take place. This is the 3rd exhibit that you've had for Black History Month. How does this exhibit differ from the ones that you've done in the past couple years? Well,
when we first started, we started with African American first, and they're mostly, everything we do is Providence centric because it's the Providence City Archives.
Makes sense.
So it was mostly African American first in Providence. The first African American police officer, the first African American council person, etc. The second year we did black suffrage in Providence in the African American community on the east side, which was primarily off of Meeting Street. There's actually a black church that was up there that was kind of the central hub of that community, and we talked about the community itself, and then the suffrage movement that happened about during the Door Rebellion with the African American community. They actually lobbied to achieve the right to vote, but of course, it was the first step because only African American males could vote at that point. As you know, women's suffrage came much later. But it was primarily focused in the 19th century, whereas this is kind of like phase 2. So we're trying to focus it more on the 20th century.
Neat. Well, it sounds like a very exciting exhibit. So that opens up on Thursday, a special event February 22nd at 11 a.m. So if you're interested. I'm curious, let's move on our conversation to the archives itself. Are the archives open to the public in general? Do you have to make a special appointment?
Oh yeah, they're open. We're open 8:30 to 4:30 Monday through Friday, and there's no appointment necessary. We're kind of unique with a lot of archives where we don't make people come for an appointment. It helps if you have a very complex research question. We can actually prepare the material for you before you come in, but anyone's welcome. We house all our records are public, the people's records, so they're always available for people to view. And we have records going back from 1637 to present. It doesn't matter who you are. If you want to see some of our earliest records, we'll gladly show you them and take them out for you. So
I always think it's neat when you have the documents and you have the records dating back and so significantly, but it's also special when they're put together in a way like the exhibit that's coming up on Thursday, because it's put together to tell a story,
exactly.
Our story, correct?
Yeah. That's the thing. We could hide it away and seal it away, but our mission at the Archives is to collect, preserve, and make available. And I think make available is the most important part of that. And part of that, making this stuff available, is making it available through exhibits, making sure we have, we can be open so for people to view this stuff, and just being accessible.
Yeah, definitely being accessible. Let's talk a little bit about how extensive this collection is. You said you have stuff dating back to 1637.
Yep.
I can imagine that's quite a bit. Talk to me just about the magnitude of the records of the archive.
It can actually get pretty overwhelming. We have 20,000 cubic feet of records. We have about 6,000 to 8,000 off-site storage, and we have records throughout the city. DPW has a lot of historic records. Actually, the Planning and Development has some historic records. So we have a lot of records. And being one of the older cities in this country, we've accumulated a lot of stuff. I'm sure the or the Seattle Archives is far smaller than us because they haven't been around as long as we have. But
maybe not as much. What are some of the things that the archives do collect? Are there some things that you think might not be as historically significant, and what are some things that you do hang on to?
We always collect city-generated documents, so it's funny because a lot of, we're not finite. We're constantly receiving records, and actually a lot of our job is managing incoming records, which is another segment called records management. So we have to manage all the records that are coming in from the city, as recent as probably last year. And those can be something as mundane as invoices to something as significant as, a resolution that passed that was pretty important, like, or of that nature. Sometimes we collect something called ephemera. People donate things. Usually we don't, because archives don't usually take in 3D objects, we call them, or museum objects, like something like that.
Oh, I know, we do have some good antiques.
We did a police exhibit for the 150th anniversary of the police department a few years ago, and we got approached by a woman whose ancestor was a police chief in Providence during the turn of the century, and we have his hat, we have his billy clubs, so we have all kinds of things. We have some coats and jackets that we received from the Providence Police Department. So we're getting more and more of those kind of objects in, and they're great for exhibits. People love seeing that stuff and holding that stuff.
That's pretty cool. Do you have significant records of like maps and layouts and how the city looked? Because this city has changed significantly over the course of its time with waterways,
exactly.
with the foundation. I mean, the way you read about how this city has formed has changed significantly from when it first started. Do you have that kind of document?
Oh yeah, we have they call them plat maps, which plat out different lots that people used to own. We have atlas maps. We have some of them are city generated. Some of them are they're generated by the privately. We actually have insurance maps, fire insurance maps going back to the 1920s, which a lot of researchers like because they actually documented buildings and things, so you can see how they changed through time, and even things like railroad maps and things, because Providence had a significant railroad system. We actually, the Union Station was one of the second largest train stations in the country during the turn of the century. So we have all kinds of different maps, and they're generated by different entities, and I'd say that's a very important segment of our collection, just to see, as you said, the changes in time to the urban architectural environment of the city.
Do you think that having all those documents and being able to have them on hand can help as we move forward in our future to urban planning development, and as we are impacted by whether it's storms, fires, that kind of thing?
Yes, definitely. I forgot to mention too that we have a significant blueprint collection. We don't have too many blueprints of private buildings per se, but mostly of municipal buildings and things of that nature. In fact, actually, we recently had we have the blueprints for the Industrial Trust Bank building tower, or AKA the Superman building, and we had them digitized recently because they're very fragile, these blueprints, and these things were from 1924, and these architects would abuse these things. They'd open them up right in the field, basically, so to speak, and go through them. So we had that digitized recently, and so I think they're important, especially the blueprints, because once they're gone, they're gone. And
once they're gone, they're gone. As we kind of wrap up here, talk to me a little bit about maybe some of your favorite items in the collection, or maybe some VIP items in the archive.
Well, I'd say the VIP is probably my favorite items, to be completely honest. But my favorite item is the 1637 compact, the town compact, which has the original proprietors of Providence. And it was signed in 1637, a year after Roger Williams came here. And they came down from Massachusetts. And it's the first document in the Western world to outline the separation of church and state. And it's a small little document. It was written on deer skin. And we have it conserved and sealed, but people can come in, I can take it out for them, they can see it. And I think it's one of the most precious documents we have in the archives.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Okay, definitely. And I guess my last question is, because it is President's Day as we move forward in February and celebrating several presidents' birthdays, do we have any historical documents within the city of Providence of presidents coming to visit here and spending a lot of time here?
It's funny you mention that, because I've been doing a lot of research on that. It's something I've been pretty interested in. We've had a lot of presidents visit here. We had George Washington visit here, all the way up to we had JFK, of course, over at at former Exchange Place. It became Kennedy Plaza after he visited in November of 1960. Lyndon B. Johnson was here. Even Richard Nixon. We have photographs of Truman here, Roosevelt.
Wow.
It seemed to be a popular stop for the presidents. And of course, Lincoln was here. He actually spoke over at the Union Station Railroad, the first incarnation of it, before it burned down in the 1880s and they built a new one. But,
oh my goodness.
There was there's a lot of Lincoln supporters in Providence during the 1860s, so he stopped here.
Wow. Do we
during
have
his 1860 election?
Is there any memorial, do we know, in Providence for him?
He
was here,
there's a plaque.
There's a plaque.
But there's no actual real memorial.
There's a plaque, though.
Yeah.
All right. Good to know.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Well, Caleb, thank you so much for joining me today. It was such a pleasure to meet you.
Anytime.
Hopefully we filled in some of you history buffs on some exciting things within the Providence City Archives, and it is open to the public. So if you need to scratch your history itch, you can head over and make an appointment. That way he can help you a little bit more. Also, the exhibit that is opening on Thursday is called Home, the Housing Struggle in Providence from 1950 through today. So Caleb, thank you again so much for joining me. We're going to get set up here for our next guest on Golocal Live, so hang tight with us as we get ready for that. Awesome. Great job.
Great. Thank you.